Back when he had heard Grant's analysis of the case, a part of him was moved to believe that Melvin was innocent. However, as this part of him was very, very small, he still treated Melvin as a normal inmate. But ever since Melvin injured Ali, the scales in Carter's heart suddenly tipped in the other direction, because if Melvin was really wicked at heart, he wouldn't have asked about Ali's crime before determining whether it was deserving of him going hard on this person. Carter had a clear-cut standard of good and evil. Similarly, his treatment towards these two different types of people was poles apart. As such, the reason that he said he would help Melvin wasn't because of the library, nor was it because of the warden. It was purely out of the sense of justice that he carried in his heart. Melvin had already missed a few days of financial news. Carter helped him fill in the important highlights from these past few days, then left him to study the stocks. The library was very quiet. Normally, Carter would be reading strawberry planting techniques for Melvin at this time. But since the book was already completed, Carter had nothing to do. He picked up the latest week's Sudoku, pointing his pencil to a square. Just as he was about to start working it out, Melvin reported a number from beside him. 3. Fine, it really was a 3. Carter continued down, and Melvin spoke again. 8. Carter breathed in deeply, speedily working to the next empty square, but before he could be sure, he heard Melvin speak again. 1. Too easy. Melvin unhurriedly shifted his gaze away, going back to study the candlestick chart that was incomprehensible to Carter. Do you have a problem? Carter glared crossly at Melvin. I'm a little bored. Melvin turned his head over, gazing at Carter. Won't you tell me a joke? No. Melvin rested his elbow on the table surface, propping up his chin, looking bored out of his mind. As if Carter could care less whether or not Melvin was bored. He picked up his Sudoku again, but as he continued solving it, he also began to feel a little bored. So he bumped Melvin with his knee, saying, I want to ask you something. Answer me honestly. Melvin, with his chin in a hand, turned his head to look over at Carter. Were you wrongfully charged? When Carter asked this, his gaze remained fixed on the newspaper in his hands, as if he was asking about an utterly insignificant trifle. Melvin didn't immediately answer, but changed from a forward-leaning posture to lean back into his seat, returning Carter with a question. If I said that I was framed, would you believe me? Carter set down the newspaper in his hands, meeting Melvin's gaze squarely. He said, I would. These two words, like Carter's question, were spoken breezily, as if they didn't carry an iota of weight. But Carter had clearly caught a dazed expression flit past Melvin's gaze, as though he didn't expect that he would be this frank and this unhesitant. Well, it did make sense. From the moment they were acquainted, they had only been testing the waters, probing back and forth at each other. Carter was always hiding himself before Melvin, never telling him his honest opinions. Now, having abruptly revealed his heartfelt thoughts, it was no wonder that Melvin was caught off guard. Melvin very quickly concealed the dazedness in his gaze, and when he next spoke, even the line of his lower jaw had turned softer. Officer James, you're a good man. You haven't answered, said Carter. Stop changing the subject. You can trust me. This time, Melvin finally gave Carter's question a straight answer. I'm also a good man. Carter averted his gaze from Melvin's face, quietly continuing the Sudoku on the newspaper. Although he long had a hunch that it was very probable that Melvin was wrongfully charged, hearing this personally come out of Melvin's mouth still felt quite different. At this time, Carter nosedived again into a complicated mood. In the past, he no longer felt any guilt over Melvin as he had considered Melvin a convict. Now, based on his own definition of good and evil, Melvin was drawn apart from the wicked. And now, he seemed to be, perhaps, possibly, maybe, starting to feel guilty about his voyeurism on Melvin again. Nearing the end of work, Carter made a mental checklist of items he needed to purchase at the supermarket later. It was Friday yet again. Under normal circumstances, he would make a trip to the supermarket on this day to buy beer or snacks to tide him through the leisurely weekend. There was a sports broadcast on this week. A bit more beer would be good. Oh right, his strawberry jam was about to run out as well. He should replenish his stock. Carter's standard breakfast was strawberry jam on toast, simple to make and simple to eat. Sometimes when he got up late, he could also grab his toast and go. It soon became 5 in the afternoon. Carter went to the locker room to change into casual wear, then headed for the car park as usual. Old Wang was still fiddling with his phone while watching dramas in the mailroom. Carter greeted him as he always did, but today when Old Wang caught sight of him, he called him right over. "Hey, hang on, Officer James." Old Wang took something from his desk, passing it through the window. "An inmate said to give this to you." "Which inmate?" Carter took the item from Old Wang. It was a glass jar, filled with a concentrated gooey red something inside. That guy. Old Wang seemed unable to remember the inmate's name and number. "The guy that you read to. He said he personally made it for you to thank you for reading to him." "Melvin?" Carter glanced at what was in his hands. It was a jar of strawberry jam. There was a large supermarket nearby the community where Carter lived, which also sold goods produced in Southside Prison. Carter had long known that the strawberry jam he ate was produced by the prison, but the glass jar in his hand wasn't quite the same as the one sold in the supermarket. The jar carried no label, and the pulp wasn't as finely ground as the one sold there. It was apparent that this wasn't factory-made. From the message that Old Wang passed on, this was strawberry jam handmade by Melvin, and there was indeed some difference when compared against those produced in the factory. Carter placed the strawberry jam in the front passenger seat, started the car, and drove out of the prison car park. In recent, Carter had a vague conjecture. He kept getting this feeling that Melvin knew that he was his neighbor. Whether it was his cologne, or how far they stayed, the way Melvin probed him was far too incisive, as if he had a clear objective all along. Moreover, Carter's answers were not quite up to standard. Melvin asked him why his bedroom was filled with the scent of his cologne, and Carter chose to evade the question. In general, he should find Melvin's question baffling instead, because he wouldn't have known that someone had smashed a bottle of cologne into Melvin's bedroom. As for the question about the proximity of their residences, Carter's answer further exposed that he knew Melvin's address. He actually had many excuses he could glaze it over with, for example, that he was a prison staff and had seen Melvin's file. But Melvin never gave him the opportunity to patch up behind himself, never following up after getting the desired information out of him. The feeling it gave him was as if Melvin already had an answer in his mind and was merely ascertaining it. What a pain. If Carter were to say that his first impression of Melvin was that of a very sensual man, then his second impression would be that this was a very dangerous man, and subsequently, his third impression would be that this was a very headache-inducing man. As the car pulled into the community, Carter gradually came to terms with the fact that he might already be exposed. But he really couldn't get when and how exactly he had exposed himself, and how much Melvin knew of his pet hobby. However, what he could be sure of was that it was because he had first said that he believed in Melvin, thus receiving his trust, that Melvin would act in such a self-destructive manner, giving the game away. Slowly pulling to a stop in front of the supermarket, Carter loosened his seatbelt, deciding not to fry any more of his own brain cells over Melvin. Weekends were for letting loose and relaxing. It was unlike Carter's style to bring work from the prison back home. He went around the supermarket purchasing every item on his list, except for strawberry jam. One jar of jam could last him half a month. Now he had a fresh jar in the car. Buying extra stock would just be a waste of its shelf life. Upon returning, Carter set the many grocery bags on the coffee table, bringing that dubious jar without production date, without quality checks, without any branding whatsoever to the kitchen. He took out a spoon from the cabinets and dug a small spoonful of strawberry jam from the jar for a taste. When it entered his mouth, a cloying sweetness exploded in his oral cavity, and only after curling his lips into a thin line was he able to faintly taste the natural acidity of strawberries. Too sweet. Carter frowned, his shoulders shrinking in from the sheer sweetness, gooseflesh rising on his back. Was Melvin trying to murder him by sugar overdose? Everyone had different taste buds. In any case, to Carter, this jar of strawberry jam was way beyond the sweetness level that he could tolerate. He wavered for a while but still ended up making another trip out to buy a few lemons from the supermarket, further processing this dubious, unbranded, and unlicensed product until it was barely passable by his standards. Carter spent most of this weekend tending to his lawn, incidentally also taking to wash his garage and the pavement in front of his house. The house across the street was still as dismal as before. The yard was overgrown with weeds and the goose yellow curtains had turned dark gray. No one had tidied up the ransacked interior. It was quite probable that a thick layer of dust had accumulated in the house. He wondered how Melvin would feel seeing his house in such a state after getting out of prison. But then again, this house had already been seized by the court. Perhaps it would already be auctioned off before Melvin's release from prison. Even if Melvin ultimately managed to exonerate his name, as stipulated by the law, the person who bought the house wasn't mandated to return the property rights. By then, Melvin would cease to be his neighbor. His thoughts seemed to be straying a little too far ahead. In this period of time, the house across the street had remained empty, and Carter had gradually gotten used to not having anyone to spy on. His voyeuristic tendencies didn't appear to be as severe as he had imagined. Similar to how he couldn't be bothered to watch inmates smoke and play cards in the recreation room, if there wasn't anyone who roused his interest, then he would be unable to raise any impulse to peek in as well. On this night, Carter wound his watch before sleeping again. For some reason, this watch seemed to be ticking slower and slower lately, requiring to be wound every day now, when he only had to do so every 2 or 3 days before. Perhaps this was a common issue of old watches. If it really couldn't cut it, then Carter might have to buy a new watch still. Placing his watch on the nightstand, Carter lay in bed. The advantage of living in the suburbs was that the nights were extremely quiet and were also without the annoying light pollution of the city. After shutting his eyes, only tranquil darkness was left in the world before his eyes. But before he could fall asleep, the darkness suddenly started to flash with unsettling crimson flares. Immediately sensing that something was wrong, his eyes flicked open and he pulled the curtains open, only to see that the small house across the street was enveloped by a raging fire, tongues of flame wildly licking out of the bedroom window. Fire! Help! Some neighbors had already come out in their pajamas to help put out the fire, whereas Carter speedily called the fire brigade, then leapt out of bed to join the firefighting army. A fire engine quickly arrived. Firefighters took over the hydrant pipes from the residents and, together with high-pressure water jets from the fire engine, eventually extinguished the fire within the hour. The neighbors standing around were in fervent discussion. Carter heard someone say that there had to be an accelerant involved in a fire of such magnitude, or the fire wouldn't have spread so quickly and taken so long to put out. Back home, Carter gave Grant a call, telling him of the fire at Melvin's house. Grant came rushing over from the city at once, standing in front of the ruins of Melvin's house, looking furious. I recently brought up HX management to the higher-ups again, but without evidence, I can't open a case. What evidence do you need? Carter asked. While wasn't very familiar with the way financial cases went, he did at least know that the regulatory board wouldn't review a firm without prompt. It was only with the appearance of something afoot would they have the grounds to open a case for investigation. The last time we investigated HX management was because a few stocks they shorted had noticeably fluctuated in an abnormal manner. The matter was closed with Melvin's sentencing and can't be reopened. Unless the stock market shows abnormal activity again, or if other suspicious clues appear, there isn't any way to open another case against them. Carter frowned, giving it a brief thought before asking, "So the most critical element is still the clues Melvin is holding on to, right?" "Yes. I'm now inclined to believe that Melvin does have clues with him," said Grant. "The timing is too coincidental otherwise. I had only just raised it to my higher-ups a few days ago, and now someone has come over here to burn Melvin's house down." This was already the third time that someone had intruded on Melvin's property. Likely unable to find what they were looking for the past 2 times, they couldn't set their minds at ease and simply set fire to Melvin's house to get rid of it. "What kind of clues are they?" Carter asked. In our past communications, he mentioned that they were photos and audio recordings of the CEO of HX Management, Wu Peng, having dinner with someone important. Could they be hidden online? We've already checked his computer. There are no records of them being uploaded. Also, it's easy to wipe stuff like that online. He's got to be keeping them with him. If that's the case, Carter mused, they have to be on a memory card. This is giving me a headache. Grant rubbed the back of his head frustratedly. His social circle is small. We've already checked everyone there can be. It isn't possible for him to bring this into prison. Could it really have been burnt in the fire? Carter lifted his chin, gazing at Melvin's house. Even the window frames had warped in the fire. If those somethings were actually in his house, even if he had hidden them flawlessly, they likely would have lost its value by now. Don't worry, Carter said. He must have left a back door. Grant shifted his gaze away from Melvin's house, staring at Carter, baffled. How do you know? Intuition, probably, said Carter. With how clever his mind was, Melvin was sure to have hidden the clues somewhere secure. It mainly depended on whether he was willing to trust Grant enough to hand the clues over. At this, Carter sighed. He glanced at Grant askew. You know, shouldn't you check inside your unit first? God damn it, I know that we must have a mole too, Grant couldn't help but swear. If it were Carter, under such circumstances, he wouldn't be willing to hand over the chip in his hands as well. I've applied for a meeting, but he didn't agree to it, said Grant. I'm thinking of applying again next week. Can you help me put a word in with him? Carter fell silent. Frankly, he didn't really want to help Grant with this. It wasn't because he couldn't be bothered, but that Melvin didn't even trust Grant. If he vouched for Grant and something went wrong on Grant's end, then he didn't know how to account for that with Melvin. Relax, it's just a casual chat, Grant said. He should want to know the present situation with HX management, right? Carter thought it over carefully again. It wouldn't harm Melvin to get a better understanding of the situation outside. Besides, he was a smart guy and could make the call himself. So Carter said, All right, I'll bring it up to him. Carter didn't like to meddle in inmates' personal affairs because the chances of being wrongfully convicted were extraordinarily slim. While he could tell who among them was genuinely remorseful, it didn't mean that they deserved sympathy. In the half-year thereabout that he had worked at Southside Prison, only Melvin was in prison because he was framed. This was also the first time that Carter had encountered such a situation, and his useless sense of justice kept knocking at him. So, perhaps, it was fine if he offered Melvin a little help. On the Monday of a new week, Melvin came to the library as per normal. As per usual, Carter sat in his work area. He looked at the computer screen when turning on the computer and entering the password, and asked, How do you know that I like to eat strawberry jam? Melvin wrung the hands that were just released, his tone even as he replied, I happened to see you buying it at the supermarket before. This wasn't a probe, nor was it a hint. It was blatantly telling Carter, I know you live near me. In putting the password, Carter's hands paused. He hit the enter button and the merry startup tune rang from the computer. He reclined back in his seat gazing at Melvin. Your house was set on fire yesterday. Neither of them brought up the subject of their addresses, but they tacitly completed their information exchange. They weren't hiding anymore. They were both voluntarily telling the other, I know that you know that I'm your neighbor. What happened? Melvin asked. Should be the guy from last time, Carter said. Hearing this, Melvin fell into his thoughts. Carter idly used his index to knock the surface of the table, saying, By the way, the strawberry jam that you made is too sweet. I even had to process it myself. Really? Melvin's eyebrows lifted. He looked at Carter. I thought that you'd have a sweet tooth, so I deliberately added extra sugar for you. Carter was speechless. Which eye of yours did you use to discern that I have a sweet tooth? Dunno. Melvin tilted his head slightly, giving Carter a once-over. I just feel that you're very sweet.